So good afternoon to everybody. And so now we have left the panel discussion, and we have 1 hour for this discussion. We received multiple questions. I recorded all of those. I'm not sure that we can really discuss each one question, but at least we will have a couple of representative questions. Yeah? So I would say that at this point, let's pray together and then delve into the questions. Yeah? Jesus, Lord, we want to thank you for your blessings during this day and that you have been with the presenters, with the respondents, also with the attendees, and that you have blessed this symposium and that it was insightful, thought-provoking, and also breaking new ground in various areas. Lord, we want to ask you to also be with us now during this panel discussion and yeah, to help us to answer the questions well and in a way that yeah, creates more understanding. Bless this hour that we have together. We thank you for this in your wonderful name. Amen. Good. So we, as I said, we received a number of questions, and I thought what I will do is that I will first ask questions kind of in the order that that you presented. So starting with the morning presentations, and then after each person has answered like one question, we move backwards, and then maybe a question for everybody, and we see how far we go, right? So at the beginning, we had Adrian Petra presenting a paper on Ellen White and John Milton. And so question that we got here was the following one. So let's face it, the two works look similar with some differences, and Ellen White was expounding on it. I guess the question would be, who do we believe and why? And then further, why did Ellen White never come out and say she used Milton's work critically? And also, a third point would be, wasn't Willie White too young for us to use his account as a valid testimony?
All right. So first of all, thank you for the question. I think that we don't have to choose to believe either one of them. It's not about believing whether one is right and the other one is wrong, or who was the first or who was inspired. It's not about that. It's just we see, especially from the order of ideas and the organization, we see that Ellen White used John Milton's account to expand her description that she saw in the vision that she is mentioning in 1858 in the Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. And he's following, and later in Patriarchs and Prophets, she refines and changes, but we don't have to choose whether to believe or not. So I think I mean, Ellen White mentioned that she read Paradise Lost. She mentions that. And we have the Arthur White who knows about it. We know that Willie White knows. I mean, if he was too young to remember that event, and I think probably it's true, he was too young, it means that somebody told him. So the story was known, but they did not go into the public and say, oh, Ellen White used these sources and these are the footnotes of her writings, because they didn't do that. So I think that's, yeah, my perspective on things. I mean, she was not interested in saying, oh, this is, I mean, as she is mentioning in the introduction of the Great Controversy, she says, you know, God's truth is, I mean, all truth is God's truth in a sense. So she's not interested in quoting, and especially this is way before she writes the Great Controversy, the introduction to the Great Controversy. So she's not interested in that, because the common practice of the time was to just use the ideas that were common. And in addition to that, I think Ellen White was familiar with the description of the Great Controversy somehow in the background of her Methodist upbringing. So she was not a stranger to that. But I mean, given that John Milton was revered during that time, as I mentioned in the paper, I think she just used him and critically, of course, but used him because it reflected, I mean, he reflected and the poem reflected what she wanted to say. Yeah.
Thank you. I think we have actually a couple other people that have done a little bit of research of that on that. So I don't know if Terry or Alberto, if you want to add something, or maybe somebody else. So if you feel I would like to expand on what is said or add something, I mean, you're welcome to do that. Yeah. So I don't just want to focus on one person. So I don't know, is there anything that you would like to add, or should I move on?
Well, I like the way that he summarized it, and I think yeah, I just would agree with that.
Mhm.
Just a brief comment. I'm writing a paper right now for a class. It's the end of the semester here at Andrews, regarding Milton's Christology and Ellen White's Christology in in both narratives of the War in Heaven. And in my research, there is a lot of similarities in the way they both describe the War in Heaven, but at least Christology speaking, they are very diverse in some sense. Like in Newton, the Christ is much less equal to the Father in Milton's Paradise Lost than in Ellen White's description, especially in the Patriarchs of Prophets, to the last version of her description of the War in Heaven. So I think although there is some similarities regarding phraseology, the reasoning, I think there is stark differences in their theology.
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I think I would just add another question here for Adrian. It says there are some similarities between White's account and Jonathan Edwards' account and other works. Why is it assumed that she especially was influenced by Milton? It seems probable there were multiple influences.
That's a good observation. Yeah, I think there were multiple influences, and like us today, right? We read, and what we read becomes what we are, what we think sometimes. So we filter, but we take in that. I mean, they did not have the same opportunities, I mean, to read and everything, but they participated and listened to sermons and so on and so forth. Yes, Jonathan Edwards was influential, but he was more, I mean, he was a Calvinist in his approach. So I did a little bit of study on, I mean, another aspect of Jonathan Edwards, but his approach was different from John Wesley in that regard. So I think Ellen White was more familiar with the Wesleyan Methodism because she grew up in that. She was somehow within that. And regarding specifically why she was influenced by Milton, I'm just referring to the description of this pre-human satanic fall. I mean, the fall into sin. So we see the order of ideas, we see the same, some expressions and some words that are similar, and the order. I mean, when you see the order, I mean, you have one angelic dialogue, and then you have another thing, and then another angelic dialogue, and then the angel travels there. And I mean, this narrative, I mean, this kind of a backbone narrative that she has reflects Milton's narrative. And I think that was there, you know, for them, embedded in their, you know, I think every culture has its own poets, and sometimes you can describe some things in your reality or in your context by using those poets. We have that in Romania, you have that in the US, in Germany, or in other places. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind when we think of it also.
Okay, thank you. So I would move now to Alberto, but of course others are welcome to also add something if you feel there's something that you would like to comment. So a question comment and question that came in here for you was from an early Adventist position of not having a creed or statement of beliefs to restrict the freedom of thought or the discovery of new truths. we have come to a moment in our development where the statement of the 28 fundamental beliefs is used as a kind of a form of a creed and boundary of what is considered orthodox in Adventism. Do you consider the obligatory acceptance of Ellen White's gift of prophecy part of this development? And has it become a belief that identifies orthodoxy in the church?
Thank you for the question. This question can become a little bit tricky, and because it encompasses a lot of other developments. But in my research, I actually have found that there is much more emphasis in Ellen White linked to our doctrinal system explicitly after 1951 and 1980s, or the General Conference that voted the 27 fundamental beliefs, probably because they are reacting to crisis, criticisms, and all that. So they explicitly stated that Ellen G. White is part of the belief in the spirit of spiritual gifts, and also that it's linked to the identity of the remnant. Uh, although in the prologue of our fundamental beliefs vote in 1980s, it says that the Bible it's our only creed. Actually, the way that we use our fundamental beliefs it's much more strict than our former pioneers. But in another way, how should do it differently to maintain unity and clarity of our beliefs and all that in a worldwide church with different cultures, different continents, with millions and millions of people with different backgrounds. So I think that it reached a point of size of the church that we must have a voted fundamental belief, and we should do church order based on that belief, and believe that the Holy Spirit will guide the church to adjust that, maybe change something if necessary, or new discoveries and all that. And also, to my perception, I think that there is more in this question that meets the eye, because if someone is accepting the church without believing in Ellen G. White's gifts of prophecy, how this person would understand the identity of the remnant in Revelation 12, 17, connect to 1910 and all that. So if one of the characteristics of the remnant is having the spirit of prophecy within them, who else is a prophet in our denomination? uh, Regardless of not Ellen G. White. So who else would be the person that would say, okay, this is the gift of prophecy that we have, so we can be the remnant as described in Revelation 12:19, so 12:17. So because of that, I think that our church has matured in this understanding to say, okay, we have tested Ellen G. White enough to say that she's part of our identity as the remnant church and the gift of prophecy as mentioned in Revelation 12:17. Yeah, but it's hard to answer that because it's we have to accommodate some flexibility because we have not a fixed creed.
Thank you. I think one thing that might be added is even though early Adventists, they often said explicitly, we do not have a creed. Yeah. When we look at it, how they, for example, reacted against other denominations in their beliefs, it became clear that they kind of knew, at least internally, what they stood for. So in that sense, even so they felt like, okay, this is wrong, and we don't agree with this. So even though it may not have been like fully articulated, they kind of knew and they felt this, what we believe is right, what others believe is wrong. Yeah. So a couple months ago, Sean Brace presented a paper at the American Society of Church History. We argued that actually Adventists, at least they didn't have an explicit statement of belief early on, but they still knew what they believed. So we might argue that even though there was not a creed, they had certain convictions. Yeah? And I think that's sometimes something that we overlook. Yeah?
Yeah, and just to add, and they were in these days judging people with their understanding of their, especially their distinct beliefs, right?
Mhm.
So even though there's not in list, they were not accepting people or disfellowship people regarding the core beliefs that they had, like the sanctuary, the Sabbath, and all that. Especially the Sabbath, you have reports like in the records of the Monterey Church in the early 60s that they were disfellowship people because they were working Sabbath or saying some things about the Sabbath. So they did not have a creed or statement of belief that back then, but they were already disfellowship people because they were not accepting the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a core doctrine. So I think that the gift of prophecy was at the end of the line of all our distinct prophecies regarding church fellowship and all that. So that's why it's took a little bit longer to be clearly stated.
Mhm. So I think maybe that also runs a question that was also sent here, and it's has to do with terminology. So how is the term communion or fellowship defined as it is used by the early pioneers? And are those designations equal to membership? So, like, if somebody in that sense, they said, well, we we distance ourselves, or a certain person shouldn't be fellowshipping with us anymore, or shouldn't have communion with us anymore, is that the same as membership? Yeah.
No, it's not the same. Communion, at least I did not did a thorough research regarding the use of the terminology of communion, but they use, at least in my mind, it came that they use this term as reflecting the Lord's Supper and also having some friendly relationships with other denominations and all that. Um, I like the response of Jerry Moon that highlighted that I have to nuance a little more what they mean with tests.
Mhm.
So, some in many places they use test as church order, like disciplinary issue, administrative issues. But in many places they use the terminology of test to refer as a spiritual thing, like it's a test related to your salvation or obedience. If you do not accept that, or if you not obey that testimony that came from God, it's your salvation that it is in risk. So they use the terminology that it's a test for you for your salvation.
Mhm.
They are not like saying that they will be disfellowshipped or talking about church administrative issues using the word test. So you have to understand that it's not everywhere that they have done this like church order thing or something like that. But no, they are not the same actually. Membership, communion, and test fellowship. They are different faces of the same issue. Yeah.
Maybe I would add one last question here, and that is based on something that George Butler said in the 1880s. Um, it's not one of the questions that came in, it's more like a question from my side. Yeah. Butler at that time, he said that when people want to join the church, we expect from them to agree with the biblical doctrine of spiritual gifts, also with the biblical prediction of an end-time manifestation of the prophetic gift, and to have an openness to test the writings of Ellen White for themselves. And so I thought that was interesting. So, because it seemed to imply that he had sufficient confidence, let's say, in the prophetic gift manifested in Ellen White's experience, that if people read her writings with an open heart and open mind, that they would come to conclude that she was divinely inspired and had received messages from God. And I wonder if maybe today we no longer have that same confidence, and therefore we try to um, kind of fix it beforehand. Yeah? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's I did not mention the presentation for sake time, but in the written paper there is this quote from Butler, and yeah, it's an excellent point, and it seems that reflect Ellen G. White's own perception, as he mentioned that the doubt in her writings could be overcome only by the person's experience with them. So it's a very interesting point that we should be open to trust that if someone with an open heart will compare her writings to the Bible and read her writings, probably this person will accept the prophetic gift and maybe also value her writings as divine or inspired guidance for the church or the women or for their personal lives.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because it basically required only things that were biblical from them and to have this openness to test. Yeah. And so with that, they could become members. Yeah. But it showed this trust in the gift, basically. Yeah. Or the confidence in there. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. Anybody wants to add something?
I just had a quick question. I'm just reflecting on your reference to Butler and wondering if that stance was adopted, how that might affect the wording of the current fundamental belief.
Maybe. I don't know.
Interesting.
Good question. Yeah. Okay. Then I would turn to Wendy. Yeah. And we also got some questions for you here. And let me see which one I would choose. So given that Ellen White was highly influential in shaping Seventh-day Adventist, like you might say, theological perspectives and practice, so why do you think her promotion of the reform dress did not gain widespread adoption in the church?
Yeah, Dennis, I think that's a really interesting question, and one I wrestled with actually. I was writing the paper itself. And as I wrestled with it, I thought, okay, let me compare how she was successful with alcohol and tobacco in comparison with dress reform. Okay, why is there a difference between these different interventions regarding health? And so as I looked at that, I think the other thing I looked at very carefully was, what does she say about what she has seen about dress?
Mm-hmm.
And there is no clear evidence that she saw an actual style. She talks about lengths and principles, but she doesn't actually talk about a specific style. So when I'm kind of evaluating this, I think, first of all, because she only saw information, she doesn't say, like, I've got all this information about this total style. She only kind of comments on little bits of it. It didn't give the same definitive stance to people as, God has shown me that tobacco is, or the alcohol, right? It's not quite as definitive. The second thing I think, which I believe is very significant here, was the severity of the persecution of those who are actually wearing it. And I think Ellen White underestimates that. It doesn't actually, even when she's talking about why it's given up, doesn't mention it at all. But just imagine being ridiculed every time you go outside because of what you're wearing. There's only so long you're going to put up with that before you're going to go, oh, this is just too much, because it's not really central to my faith. And so, on the other hand, when you look at alcohol and tobacco, okay, you're giving up something. You might get the occasional ribbing from a mate because you're not going out drinking with them or whatever, but it's not that continual ridicule that's associated with it. So I think there's some fairly significant external factors, as well as the lack of specificity around the information around dress.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, yeah. So you mentioned that Ellen White faced significant resistance in promoting the reform dress. So do you think this resistance was primarily theological or cultural or pragmatic or?
Listen, I think theological is the very least of them. I think pragmatic first, followed by cultural, and then theology really a very, 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 very distant third in that list.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think this whole being ridiculed very much is a very pragmatic thing. What am I going to do if I'm faced with this? And then, okay, what does my culture tell me is appropriate? And my culture is telling me that this dress is vulgar and immodest and is masculine, and it's all of these other things. and therefore I need to be in line with my culture. So I think those first two, pragmatic and culture, are important, but theological not so important in the resistance at this time.
I do remember that in the so most of this was happening in the 1860s, yeah. So like late 1860s. If I remember correctly, in the 1890s, I think maybe it was earlier. Yeah, there were some women that rediscovered Ellen White's statements, and they said, "What? So Ellen White had shown God like how to dress, and so they tried to figure out how these dresses looked like, and so they tried to wear these dresses then in the 1890s, and which attracted Ellen White's rebuke, where she said, if you do that, you bring the church into disrepute, because it looks like that we're like some old timers or so. Yeah? And so where she basically emphasized certain the principles that you had mentioned of modesty, economy, simplicity, and health, and so on. And when she then pointed out also that that the culture or the fashion had changed, and so that nowadays it was basically you could buy multiple dresses that fit these principles. I don't know how far your study went. Are you aware when culture changed or fashion changed so that it became acceptable for Adventists? That might maybe also play into the question of that All Might basically said, okay, I'm done with this. This is not as important to like to push this reform dress, you know?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, because my focus was really on the reform dress itself. But I did certainly have a look, and I did see those statements you're talking about, Dennis. And the thing that interests me the most, because that the reform certainly is occurring in the late 18, starting in the 1880s, but certainly moving into the 1890s. But there is actually a resurgence of bloomerism that happens in society in the 1890s because of the bicycle craze. And all of a sudden they come back into fashion a little bit, so in a different form, but to enable people to get on bicycles and ride in a modest way. So it interests me that those statements are kind of in that time period where things are just being rediscovered again. But yes, the fashion certainly had changed, and changes quite dramatically in the 90s and the up to around 1920. There's quite a lot of changes that happened in that time frame.
Thank you. I don't know, anybody else wants to add something? I think Terry, you probably also did some
Well,
research on that, huh?
yeah, I'm wondering, Ellen White was cutting edge on so many things. I'm wondering if she felt back when she first encountered the reform dress that this would be the next big thing, and it would be gradually more and more accepted. And when that did not happen, it seemed like she's not saying we don't need to be socially incomprehensible, especially when newer fashions are getting to be more healthful without being so extreme. So yeah, that letter in 1897 when she talks about not needing to go to extremes, I think she had kind of moved on.
And I think, Terry, that's in keeping with what she says right at the very beginning, about not making ourselves look like, oddities any more than we have to in society.
And so when it comes to like dress, that we shouldn't necessarily be the first ones to adopt something, but also not the last ones. Yeah?
Something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So I would move to the next presenter here, Eric Lowe. We got multiple questions for you. It's not easy to know which one I should choose. I will take this one here. So in Christian theology, the doctrine of original sin discusses the consequences of the fall on humanity. There are nuances and variations of this doctrine, as is the case of all other doctrines. While you have ably presented the elements of the doctrine of original sin in Ellen White's writings, can we not say that Ellen White did in fact endorse the doctrine of original sin? Isn't her view of original sin a variation of the doctrine, similar to other Arminian-leaning views? And is this a hesitancy to use openly the expression original sin in Adventist theology?
Yeah, good question. Actually, yes, I think that was in part what my paper attempted to do was to demonstrate that she does seem to affirm all the elements of original sin. Now, I should clarify this because among many Adventists, I grew up in circles where I was taught growing up that original sin was a Catholic doctrine. And so I grew up with this kind of false dichotomy where you either were Catholic and believed in original sin, or you were Adventist and rightly rejected it. And yet, as I've studied it further, I realized that there are versions of original sin that have progressed into Protestantism. Of course, John Calvin had a version of it that was tied to determinism. Arminius and Wesley, the Wesley Arminian views, had a version of it that would still, very much like Ellen White, affirm this idea of a corporate condemnation of some kind, but would reject this element of inherited guilt in the subjective individualistic sense. And so very much like Ellen White, we come from a long Protestant heritage through Wesleyan Arminianism that very much seems to accept original sin. And so as long as we understand that there is a Protestant view and there's a Catholic view and maybe a Calvinistic slant on it that we might reject elements of, I think we can say that we would affirm original sin with the nuances that we get later on through Arminius and Wesley. And in that regard, yeah, I see that prevenient grace solves so many of the problems that would otherwise be difficult to overcome.
So in that sense, maybe the difficulty is one of semantics, that we have like a certain term, and depending on how people fill that term, they may understand it differently. Yeah,
yeah, we just haven't really been able to define what does original sin mean. I mean, at a fundamental level, it means that Adam and Eve, when they sinned, there was an original initial sin. And what were the consequences of that? We all recognize that there were consequences. It's just what are the details of those consequences is where disagreement happens. So fundamentally, I think that we do affirm original sin. It's just in some of those sub details that we have to hash out some specifics.
So some people, they of course then they take the next step and they say, well, what about Christ? Yeah. And of course, for Adventists, that's often a natural question because of some of the discussions that we have had. So one question that is raised here is, if Ellen White teaches that we inherit corporate guilt from birth, how does this statement influence the understanding of Jesus's birth?
Yeah. This is certainly one of the foremost challenges that pops up. I think there are two statements that are helpful here. One of them is from Review and Herald, September 17, 1895. And here Ellen White says that human nature is depraved and is justly condemned by a holy God. But provision is made for the repenting sinner so that by faith in the atonement of the only begotten Son of God, he may receive forgiveness of sin. And it talks about transformation and so forth. But then in contrast, we have another statement in Desire of Ages, page 266, and it talks about Jesus, and it talks about his nature. And I think it's actually helpful in answering this question. It says, the work of Christ in cleansing the leper from a terrible disease is an illustration of his work in cleansing the soul from sin. The man who came to Jesus was full of leprosy. His deadly poison permeated his whole body. The disciples sought to prevent their master from touching him, for he who touched the leper became himself unclean. And here's one of the two key phrases. It says, but in laying his hand upon the leper, Jesus received no defilement. His touch imparted life-giving power. The leprosy was cleansed. And then it says, thus is with the leprosy of sin, deep-rooted, deadly, and impossible to be cleansed by human power. The whole head is sick, the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. And that's from Isaiah. And then here's the final kicker, really, of the point of this whole statement. She says, but Jesus, coming to dwell in humanity, receives no pollution. His presence has healing virtue for the sinner. So we would say that Jesus did come with a sinful nature because Ellen White says this many times, but it did not cause pollution. For human beings, for us, it makes us depraved. Out of my paper, I pointed out it causes us to be called born in sin with no natural goodness, lifeless faculties of the soul, she says, an evil heart, no enmity between us and fallen angels and us. Like, did Jesus have no enmity between him and Satan? Oh, of course he had problems with Satan, right? He recoiled from evil. Was he evil by nature? Was he in need of being born again? Did he need a savior himself? Like, we would have to answer no to many of these questions because there's a fundamental difference here. So I think it's nuanced. To really sum it up, I would say Jesus was like us in some respects. Yes, he came after 4,000 years of sin, as Ellen White says. Yes, he came with, frailties. He could get sick. He could be tempted by others in various ways. We know the temptation in the wilderness. But there are also some differences there. We can't say that he had an evil heart and that he was polluted, as Ellen White says of us. And so there have to be some differences there.
So he was in that sense affected but not infected, huh? If we use that terminology. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, he purified what came in contact with him.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else wants to comment on this? Or yes, Adrian? Yeah.
Thank you, Eric, for these comments. Yeah, sometimes I just want to highlight one thing. I did a study on Melanchthon and his view of sin and salvation. And towards the end of the paper, I'm just, I referenced the current debate that is in Adventism, between those who consider that sin is only an act versus sin is more than an act, is nature and so on. So sometimes, as you mentioned, Dennis, also we use certain definitions and we end up on the wrong side of the without knowing sometimes because of the fence. For example, one of the debates that I'm analyzing in that paper was between Melanchthon and some Catholics, Dr. Eck, and the issue of the debate was whether after we are baptized, as infants, sin still remains or lingers. And some said, only the foam of the sin, fomes peccati remains. And this was the Catholic view. So we can, through education, we can kind of subdue sin and educate it, and we are good persons, and God sees that, and we are sanctified, and He's justifying us because He sees that. And the other, Melanchthon was saying, even after the baptism, the power of sin remains. So we need to be converted. So putting that into 21st century Adventism, sometimes those who consider that sin is only an act, they tend to diminish sin. And it's something you can control, conquer, educate, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a danger because Ellen White never considered sin such a problem. Like a small thing that you can put on a shelf, you can put in a box, or no. It's more than, it's a power inside of you. And if you need to be, like she's mentioning that in Steps to Christ, for example, we need to dedicate our lives every day. We need to consecrate our lives daily because we are living in this context where sin is present, not just outside, but also inside.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. So I would move to Terry now. And we got an interesting question here with a couple comments. You talked about the Teal Bible. And so the person said that every copy of the 1822 Teal Bible had different illustrations. Apparently, like looking at various copies of it, there are no two copies that are identical. And so therefore the question is whether you have reviewed the actual engravings or images that are found in the Harman copy of the 1822 Teal Bible. Yeah.
That's a great question. I have not, for the purposes of this paper, done that. Mm-hmm. I'm aware that they were all different. And what I tried to do this time in the context of, trying to keep it to its required length was to show how, because there are different artists in the same volume, lots of different artists, to see a little bit of the stylistic range. So I just had those two images. And then I wanted people to see the distinct contrast between that kind of art and what you see in the Doré Bibles of 20, 30 years later, which are more unified and really quite spectacular. And I think both of those styles, those combinations of many different artists in the Teal Bibles and then the later Doré Bibles, those had an impact, but especially Doré had an impact on Currier and Ives. If you look at the Currier and Ives religious art, it looks much more like the Doré Bibles, and that was kind of the taste as you get into the latter part of the 19th century. So I think there's important work to be done to look at how those images might have affected Ellen as a child, because I did make the point that she was very visual as a child, and it would just be a natural development to look at the images in her family's Bible and think about how those registered and eventually would influence her. So that's something that needs to be done at some point, but I didn't go down that path in this particular paper.
And it's in a way interesting that by the 1880s, some of Ellen White's works, I know especially like the Red Controversy, but also then some others, they began to have also engravings. And it from the little research that I did, I realized that Willie White, for example, was quite involved in selecting these engravings. And then eventually, when some of these books were translated into various languages, they figured, well, these images, they work well in North America, but not in Europe.
Yes.
People don't like those. So then they tried to find different engravings so that it would appeal more to the taste of people there. Huh? So
I'm wondering, in Europe, did they have as much of a market for those really high-end gift books that were sold that were quite lavish?
So they were, I don't know about the market, but I know that like they began to kind of sell like the Great Controversy, also the Life of Christ, which was this edited version of Spirit of Prophecy volumes 2 and 3, in like one volume. And so those had engravings, and so they were selling those, sometimes like even taking subscriptions. Yeah. And so going from door to door and selling those. So it seems that that became really a market, especially I realize in Germany, the German Empire. This became a huge thing, and that's why German Adventism also grew so much, because especially Life of Christ became like a bestseller. Yeah?
And the illustrations would have been an important part of that, especially if they could be targeted toward that particular market. And Willie had seen all kinds of detail from his father about the various visual choices James was making in the Way of Life prints and his plan for the big book he wanted to do to go along with it. And so it sounds like Willie kind of picked up where James left off.
Yes. Yeah. I have one more, I would say, multiple part question here for you. And I think maybe Adrian may also be able to comment on that, because even though it relates mostly to you, Terry, I think maybe also to Adrian a little bit. Yeah? So it says, you mentioned that Ellen White had read Paradise Lost by John Milton. Was she influenced solely by the artwork associated with Milton's work, or was she also directly impacted by the literary content itself? That's kind of the first part. Then, in what ways might Milton's depiction of the heavenly conflict have shaped Ellen White's visions and her perspective in the Great Controversy theme? And then the third part, furthermore, considering the similarities, is it reasonable to view Milton's work as, in some sense, inspired, or at least a channel through which certain theological or imaginative themes were transmitted to Ellen White? So that's like a multi-question.
Well, first of all, in terms of visual representations of Paradise Lost, I don't know if Ellen White saw any of those. I showed one example from Blake, which I'm certain she did not see, which was pretty out there. But my point in including it was to show kind of the background context of where these ideas developed. In terms of Milton being inspired, first of all, I will say that Milton deeply believed he was inspired. He invoked the muse, and there was a deep belief in writers and artists that the muses would give them kind of otherworldly or superhuman abilities to create beauty. And I am not going to attempt to comment on whether Milton was inspired or not, but I think there's material in Milton that has the potential to be put to inspired use, certainly. And I always think, when I think about Milton, I also think about the Messiah and Handel's. How can you think he wasn't inspired to be able to produce that incredible music in the amount of time he did? There was something that was driving him so powerfully. And Ellen White sees certain things in Milton that she feels congruent with. She does not, as far as I know, I've not seen this anywhere, she does not pick up on his misogyny, for which I'm grateful, because there's a lot of it in Paradise Lost, and I don't believe that's inspired personally. But that can happen too, that a writer can have a spiritual experience, a spiritual encounter, and be able to communicate that. And then with many writers, they might layer on some cultural baggage that they already have. And so that's why I don't want to get too far into the weeds about Milton's inspiration.
Thank you. I don't know, Adrian, anything that you want to add to that? Or
Yeah, I really like the comment. I personally don't think that we need to talk about inspiration when it comes to Milton, because I mean he was a talented poet, so we can see that. I mean, talent comes from God, right? But I will not necessarily put that under inspiration, which is something else. I think Ellen White, like the way she did with other authors that use the very nice language, I mean, very beautiful language, let's say, to describe certain things about maybe Christ, about education, about health, about, you know, the great controversy. Why not? She used that language. And Milton was also, as John mentioned in his response to my paper, Milton also wrote in a certain context, so he was also influenced by others. So we cannot. I did not do any study on that. So I don't think we need to talk about inspiration here, because this is something else. And also in regard with when it comes to images, I really enjoyed the presentation on that, Ellen White's writing, journaling, and images. I mean, that triggered some ideas in my mind, so I will explore those. We know that, for example, Ellen White writes about seeing Satan in a certain position, right? And that image resembles a lot a certain image that we know it was current during that time, and it was, so we know something like that. I mean, we don't know if she used the same imagery, if she was revealed, she was shown something like that. We don't know that, but the fact that she's describing using that language means that she saw that. And sometimes, like we know from Revelation, right? Certain images, just God reveals certain images that are familiar to the prophets, right? So that they may understand and put into the best language they have the message from God.
Yeah.
So that's not a problem. That's not.
The more I think of it, I'm intrigued by her use of that brochure, the railroad brochure, while she's writing to her sister. And all the time you see writing students being instructed to copy sections of what they think is a really good writer, just to get the feel of those words coming out of their pen. And I'm not trying to create any kind of apology for any use of sources, but rather I'm thinking more of a style model, which I'm interested in the visual style of that guidebook. And when I first read it, I thought, my, she's doing well here, you know. And then I read Ron Grable's article where he had found the original guidebook, and she takes chunks of it and uses them because they're so vivid. But she also has her own vivid writing on that train trip, and she's just back and forth between her own style and what she's kind of modeling from this guidebook. When she talks about the coal smoke coming into the car, that's really well described, and that's her talking about her own experience. So it's interesting to watch that working.
Thank you. No, Alberto. No.
Can I just add, there is a book from the 80s that the title is There Was War in Heaven, actually, The War in Heaven, Paradise Lost, and the Traditions of Satan Rebellion. It was written by Stella Rivard, and she traces how there were many, many similar accounts of the war in heaven during the 1500s, 1600s. It was part of the Renaissance and also Reformation thought in England, in Germany, in Switzerland, it was everywhere. So like it's not like Milton was producing a groundbreaking thought. No, it was everywhere. What Milton did was produce a well-crafted epic that was through the ages much more popular and was regarded as almost as inspired for the Methodists from somewhere
There's a
other
whole
denomination.
tradition in that regard. No.
Yeah, and it was more influential. And just a note here you have to say about, I will also not attempt to say that Milton was inspired or not, but at least I'm studying Milton's Christology in comparing to Ellen G. White. Milton is pretty much semi-Arian or Arian, either in Paradise Lost or in his systematic book, Dogma Christiana. And although there is a development of Ellen G. White thought in that, but if you read The Desert of the Ages, Ellen White seems to me pretty much orthodox in her understanding of Christ as not being created and all that. So that's another striking difference that I just like to point.
Milton was a Puritan, but he was a very, very erudite and widely read Puritan. He wasn't so narrow as some of his Puritan brethren.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you so much. I would now turn to our last presenter, Jared Martin. But we also got a number of questions for you, and I will choose, think maybe one or two of those because we're already getting almost to the end of this discussion here. You know? So let me see where I have one here. So does God not have control over veiling and unveiling of his presence? Does he not know that unveiling his presence will result in the death of the wicked? Also, if this is not his active punishment, why does the Bible call, or why is it called by the Bible his strange act?
Yeah, certainly what I understand from what Ellen White has written is that yes, he does control it. He chose to veil it at the fall. He chooses at moments throughout history, it's unveiled, and we see that fiery presence throughout the story of the Bible. At the end of time, she says he unveils it. He's choosing it. It's deliberate. He makes that decision. And I think the description of it as a strange act of God, I think what could be more strange than the God of the universe having to veil his glory? Has that ever happened before? No, it's happened because of sinful angels, sinful humanity. And then he's done that to show mercy, to keep us alive. And then at the end of time, he unveils it to revert to what it always was and what it always should have been. But he's done that in order to give us a chance at eternity. And I think in that sense, it's very strange. It's very unique. It will never happen again. That he's done that for us because his love is so great for us.
So maybe to add to that question, so we know from Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, that Jesus cried over Jerusalem. It looks like Jesus shed tears anytime he cannot save someone, and he knows that someone will burn in the lake of fire if he or she continues to reject or refuse salvation. Do you think Jesus will shed tears over those who are burning in the lake of fire in the final judgment?
Well, as I present it, I don't think Ellen White says that the lake of fire is a literal flame. I don't see her saying that God will that he will send a fire, that it will burn, torment, and reduce people to ashes or nothingness. But of course, it's what could be more sad than beings who are designed to live forever suddenly ceasing to exist. And as God, He will retain that memory for all time. We will remember those who are no longer with us for all time. That would be incredibly sad. And yet, somehow, in the same moment, is God respecting their choice and it's what they wanted. And at some point, He says, I will not veil this glory any longer. And it's that strange act of God.
Mhm. So in that sense, they cease to exist. But since he would have loved to have everybody saved.
Absolutely.
In that sense,
And yes, and so as Adventists, we've always said annihilation, the wicked will exist no more, but it's what is that process of them existing no more?
right.
We've said, well, I haven't found that Adventists have ever defined it. We've said that a lake of fire comes. What is the nature of that lake of fire? Well, the fire will come and destroy the wicked and they will exist no more. But how? Ellen White makes the comment. If I had more time, I could have talked about it, how in the end of great controversy, she says, some will suffer for moments, some will burn for moments, some will burn for days. And so what does that look like in the context of what I presented, what she's written before then? Is it a physical suffering? Moses walks into it and he's fine. Nadab and Abihu walk into it and they die, but physically nothing seems to happen to them in that moment, but they're dead, but they are burned up and consumed.
Mhm.
So it would appear to be more of a psychological torment. For Satan, it lasts longest of all. What does that look like? He lived in the consuming fire in the very presence of God in heaven, says Ezekiel.
Mhm.
And so in what way and regard does he last the longest
Mhm.
in that? I think
I
that
think it's
requires a bit
certainly
more
certainly
discussion.
an interesting subject also to continue. I remember years ago I was doing a study, an exegetical study in the book of Daniel, the Aramaic portion, where I realized that in Daniel chapter 3, we have the three Hebrews thrown into like this oven of fire, huh? That a different word was used for the fire there than for the fire in chapter 7, where it says that fire went out from the throne of God. Yeah. So there are two different fires, two different terms used. Why? Exegetically, it was difficult to answer. Yeah.
And I
So
haven't found an Adventist author who's addressed that. The ones, most people just skirt around it. Some just say, well, God can send fire because he's God, and if he wants to burn people, he can burn people. It seems like a cop-out. But that's the prevailing view that I found.
mhm,
It's very different to suggest, as Ellen White does, that it's not a literal flame.
yeah. Thank you so much. I have one question or two questions here at the end. It was the first one asked this morning, and I thought maybe it's good to ask at the end. And it was basically the two questions here. So, what factors might account for, and that's certainly also a subjective perspective depending on where we live, yeah. But what factors might account for so many of our Adventist ministers despising the writings of Ellen White, and how might we try to tackle this problem? I know that many of us are somehow involved in Adventist education, either in theological education, or Terry, you were involved, I think, more in historical or literary education. So, Jared, you were pastoring. So in that sense, I think we can look at it from various perspectives here.
I would say it's not just pastors, it's young people. They don't know why she would be of interest to them. And it used to be when I first started teaching, because some of my students been whacked over the head with messages to young people. It's been a long time since that's been a factor.
Yeah.
And I think the revelations of the 1970s, especially, and the turmoil of not just looking at her writings, but all kinds of other things going on in the church. There needs to be, I think, more of a reckoning about how to move forward from what we've learned, and also to know that a remarkable treasure and value her life and her writings are, and but also be able to acknowledge facts. And I think that maybe with the pastors, maybe that's more of a factor. I think for young people, they just don't know why they should be interested. And I have not done a lot of this, but I visited a few classes and talked a little bit about her, and they seem interested because they seem like they just haven't thought about her as a fully developed human being with all kinds of interesting facets, and somehow they've picked up an impression that there's some kind of very restricted and stiff way of looking at her, and that's all there is. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I've found the young people in the churches that I've spoken at, they don't know who Ellen White is. And you present something and they go, wow, this is interesting. This is really, can I read one of her books? And you give it to them and they go, oh, this is really difficult to read. I know I'm supposed to enjoy this, but the language is really difficult. And so something I've been doing that may help one day in the future when it gets done, for my master's thesis, I researched the readability of Ellen White's writings and how to make them more readable to a modern audience, looking at how some of her books are written at a grade 9 or 10 reading level, whereas the average person has about a grade 7 reading level. So for someone to take her book, they can't simply read it, let alone comprehend it. And so what ways can you simplify it while retaining the original message? Can you change the vocabulary, the sentence structure, different ways, best practice principles to do that? And so been working on that with Daryl Thompson at the Ellen White Estate. Hopefully one day that will be a benefit so that people can take her writings and begin to understand them for the first time, because they were written so long ago in a different place, time, context, language. And I remember a discussion we had at Andrews Uni with many of you in this group saying that in different countries and languages around the world, this problem doesn't exist, because when you translate her works into your language, you don't translate them into 19th century German, 20th century German, you do it into modern German. But in English, we have those older ones. There are some newer modern English translations, but in talking with those who've done those, there was no formal methodology, no formal process. It was just, what did that person think at the time? And so how can we do it in a structured, methodical way to make it simple and easy for the new generations who do genuinely want to read her writings and who genuinely find them interesting when they can comprehend them. So I think it is an exciting time to be introducing her to young people.
I would agree with the two speakers who've gone before. I mean, I think in the Australian context anyway, the challenges of the 70s and 80s certainly had a significant impact. And what happened was that most of that generation, or many of that generation, just put Ellen White away and just said, hey, this is either too hard, it's destroying my church, and so let's just concentrate on something else. And what that has meant is that the current generation hasn't grown up with information about Ellen White. And so they get this ignorance that Jared has actually mentioned, because they just either that or they have the skewed views that their parents have communicated. So you have either no information or quite skewed information coming through. And then, you've got a pastor, because the question was related specifically to pastors, a pastor in training, and they get 2 classes, and is 2 classes enough to actually move and change a whole lifetime of views? And the answer is probably not, but at the same time, the theological curriculum can't handle more in there and still meet all the requirements of the IBMTE. So I think making relevant, as has been said, is really important. But I think there are some other things. I think open approaches to issues and questions are really important. Identification really early on of personal biases. And I think we need to think more carefully about the type of assessment tasks we're doing in those Ellen White classes so that we can actually identify where issues are earlier. We've just identified, for instance, in one of my third-year students, someone who's not in this line, but on the other extreme, is using Ellen White really as, okay, you don't accept her health message, therefore you're not saved, right? So another kind of extreme. But if we'd identified that in their first year when they're doing Ellen White classes, we could have acted on that a lot sooner than waiting till they're getting closer to graduate. So I think some way of exploring those prejudices and background are really important early on.
I resonate with what Jared and others said a little earlier, just with the language of Ellen White. I'd never noticed this really before because I've grown up with reading Ellen White. It never occurred to me that for some people, when they read her, it's uncomfortable, and uncomfortable in a negative connotated sense. I in my class that I've been teaching on Life and Writings of Ellen White, I had some students ask me and they said, "Hey, how is it that Ellen White, she always seems a little bit angry, or she's very upfront and sharp towards people." And I had to explain that, like, this is how you read the review of that time. Everyone talks the same way. Like, this is just how people communicate. And I hadn't actually noticed that there was a difference there just because of my overexposure in some sense. So I think this is really the tremendous benefit of pointing people to her works that are most Christocentric, because those will tend to balance out the rest of the playing field for people when they know what she viewed about Christ and about salvation and these things in a very positive, uplifting way.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, I have, for example, told students that we are at a disadvantage because Ellen White's contemporaries, they met her at camp meetings, maybe in their churches. They communicated with her. So in that sense, when they received, let's say, a testimony, there was context. Yeah, so they knew the person. We don't have this today. And so therefore we are at a disadvantage because we read her writings out of context. Yeah? And so therefore I suggested that if somebody wants to start reading Ellen White's writings, he should start reading those writings intended for a general audience, not necessarily for an Adventist audience. So start with Steps to Christ. After you have taken Steps to Christ, read her writings on Christ. Desire of Ages, Thoughts of Blessing, Christ's Object Lessons. Then read the rest of the Conflict of the Ages series. Interestingly, when people do that, they see the ideas that appear in a nutshell in Steps to Christ and how those permeate her other writings. And it just permeates all of her writings. Education, Ministry of Healing, it appears everywhere. And then move to the Adventist writings, life sketches to have a framework, and then testimonies for the church, which fits into that framework. And then people read actually these writings through her emphases that appear in the general writings, and they realize actually now things make more sense. Yeah? Another thing that I did was that I asked students, for example, to write a report of 5 documents, letters, manuscripts, diaries that they could freely choose. And write a report there would actually subjective parts, and they get points for it because that's their opinion. They're entitled for their opinion, to their opinion. And I would say that 98% of the students in the past commented positively. Most of them said it completely revolutionized my perspective of Ellen White. Before it was negative, now it's actually positive because I realize that she is not much different from us in her experiences. One student even said that reading Ellen White's diaries and like her personal letters is extremely attractive to millennials. And I said, can you unpack that? And he said, well, we yearn for authenticity. And we don't like people that pretend in church, that make up something there, that act. And so when you read her diaries, her personal correspondence, you realize how she struggled with certain things, how she felt insufficient to explain the things, describe the things that she had seen, where she admitted her sense of insufficiency. And by seeing, you could say, her making those remarks, you realize that she was authentic, making herself vulnerable so that others could basically use it against her. But that makes her authentic. And in that sense, she becomes an authority, not by being infallible or perfect, but by being similar to us. We can identify with her, relate to her, and that makes her an example. So I thought that was interesting. So in general, I've had very positive experiences with that. Yeah? But with the books, we have a nicely written text. You don't have that necessarily where you see this inside perspective of Ellen White. Yeah? So I want to thank all of you for presenting, for discussing and sharing your opinions and insights. I think this was very helpful to everybody involved today. And at the end, I would close with a word of prayer. And yeah, let's pray. Dear Jesus, Lord, we want to thank you for your wonderful love and your great care for us. We want to thank you for your many blessings during this day, for the insights, observations that we could hear today, and we could learn more about Ellen White, her ministry, her writing, speaking and travel, different things. And ultimately, all these things are supposed and intended to point us to you and grow closer to you. Lord, I hope and pray that this is what happened to all who attended these meetings today. Please bless us and use us as mighty instruments in your ministry to point people to you and to your word. Lord, we thank you for this in your wonderful name. Amen. Thank you to all of you. I wish you all the best. I will be in touch with you in writing. And also thank you to everybody who was attending today, and thank you for your interest. All the best to you. Many blessings. Bye-bye.